Good evening. Welcome to week 3 of PSHS 6240 here at George Washington University. Announcements. Okay, so paper is due, and I'll talk about that in a second. 1/29. So at 11:59 on January 29th is when it's due. If you're briefing Group 1, you'll brief at 9 o'clock on 1/26, and I will send the WebEx link this week on that. So just keep that in mind. I also just want to say is many of you seen my marking on the assignments or on the discussion boards. I'm going to be a lot harder on the paper. So if you got full credit, 100 on the discussion sections, don't be surprised if you get a 90 or even lower. That's not me being hard or even if it was a bad paper. It's graded with a lot more vigor than your discussion boards. So a review of last week. Let me go ahead and actually take a second and run through the paper. So here is the paper right here. And again, as I said, it's due next Sunday. You'll have a thesis statement, a brief background on the issue, criteria, rebuttal arguments, and then policy and recommendations. And I've attached an example paper. I'll talk about that in a second. But go ahead and this is the format I'm looking for. And I want you to choose one of these topics. Don't choose all of them. Choose one of them. Was it terrorism? Why or why not? And the key part are those facets of why you think is terrorism. A lot of you alluded to in the discussion section, it's terrorism because of these criteria. Those criteria I want you to expound upon. So keep that in mind going forward. So here's the assignment. Here's the topics, and what I'm looking for format and word length. So go ahead, pause me now, and then come back to me in a second and go, while you pause me, go to the other link about the example paper. Okay, so welcome back. As I mentioned, that's the announcement. So go to the, you just saw the example paper and how I emphasize those criteria for what I'm looking for. Please don't just rip those same criteria. Those are just example criteria that somebody used. Here are some other examples of criteria you all discussed in the last week, or argument points, if you will. Military versus non-military. There is certainly a definition of terrorism out there that is, if you attack military, it is not terrorism. Just because military aren't civilians, and we don't want to dilute the definition of terrorism. I will make that, I'll leave that up to you. Argue it one way or another, and that comes up when you're talking about Fort Hood or the Pentagon attack. Combatant versus non-combatant. This is actually a little bit different, and we've talked about this on Fort Hood. Many people will say they were not combatants. They might have been military, but they were not combatants because they were in Fort Hood. They were at home, and they had a certain respect to not be part of the battlefield. On the other side, those civilians and those people at Fort Hood were preparing soldiers to go to war. So it might not be convenient for the United States to say that Fort Hood, or it might be convenient for the United States to say Fort Hood is a non-combatant area because the combat area is Iraq or Afghanistan. But we're labeling that. We're saying that that's the combatant area. So that just keep that in mind. Were those people at Fort Hood, they might have been civilians, but were they really non-combatants? Were the people in the Pentagon who died, were they non-combatants? I'll let you argue that one way or another. State versus non-state. Some of you alluded to that a state couldn't be a terrorist entity. But then you'll also argue about state-sponsored terrorism. IRGC in Iran, the various Pakistani terrorist groups. These are state-sponsored terrorist groups. If you're going to say that terrorism is only a non-state actor, you'll have to address that issue one way or another. Targeting within or outside the locus of conflict. This was brought up in the videos when we talked about the FLN and the Irgun. Certainly, if you think the FLN was legitimate violent activity, legitimate liberation movement, you can make that argument and say, well, because they targeted French only in the occupied areas in Algeria. However, let's pretend the FLN started to blow up subway stations in Paris, outside the locus of conflict. Does that make them more a terrorist organization? Yes? No? Maybe so? I'll let you decide. Attacking the apparatus of government. The reason why we celebrate Mandela is because he focused on the apparatus of oppression, the police and the courts and others that were pillars of the apartheid regime. Certainly attacking that versus if Mandela started to blow up birthday parties and schools, certainly that would make him more amenable to a terror, or make him more a pariah going forward. War zone versus non-war zone. I think I alluded to this just a second ago. Let's take the example of the IED attack in Iraq. Well, every American's going to say Iraq is a war zone, but the guy who planted the IED, that war zone is just the strip of territory that he plants the idea, and then the IED, and when he goes home, he's not in a war zone. At least he doesn't consider himself his. But we will certainly raid his house if he's, even though, because we consider that a war zone. So that's one aspect. Is that people might say, well, Fort Hood is not a war zone because it's in Texas and it wasn't Iraq and Afghanistan. Therefore, Nidal Hasan engaged in terrorism. But was it? That's very convenient for us. Fort Hood is a war zone. From the enemy's perspective, Fort Hood is a war zone. They're prepping soldiers to go fight, his people in Iraq. So again, that's an important distinction. You can talk about the USS Cole as well. We don't think of that as a war zone. Yemen at the time in 2000, but if you're in Yemen and a big warship, comes in your house or comes in your area, you might think it's a war zone. Just something to consider. A political narrative. This might separate what terrorism is from just normal criminal activity. If the guy shooting up a school is just shooting up a school for revenge or another criminal action, he might not be classified as terrorism. But if he shoots up the school because he wants to advance right-wing extremism or jihadist extremism or what have you, you might say he has a political narrative. You can make that argument with the Orlando shooter to some extent, but I'll let you, again, you have to decide what is a political narrative. You can make the argument everyone has a political narrative. Again, I will let you parse that argument out how you see fit. Levels of oppression. As I mentioned, certain people get to do certain things. You can make the argument that the FLN was allowed to engage in violence because the French controlled all the territory. That they were so oppressive to the native Algerians that violence was their only recourse. As I mentioned, Mandela engaged in violence. A lot of times he's grouped with Martin Luther King and with Gandhi, and he shouldn't be because he actually called for violence. That's why he was arrested. But the argument is the apartheid regime was so awful that certain measures were okay. Now, what makes something so awful? I'll let you decide. Politically popular versus non-popular. The argument is that if you're politically popular, you're engaged in a liberation movement or you're in insurgency. If you're not politically popular and you don't have the population behind you, you're engaged in terrorism. Now, what is politically popular? What is the level where someone is an insurgent versus a terrorist? I'll let you decide on that. Degree of association. This is a common point when we're talking about Fort Hood, and many of you made this. Nidal Hasan was associated with a known terrorist, Anwar al-Awlaki. Therefore, his actions in his name were terrorism. You can make that same argument with Orlando, that he had pledged allegiance after the fact. Therefore, he was associated with ISIS, and therefore it's a terrorist act. However, Fort Hood, yes, he emailed back and forth with Nadal Hassan, but he wasn't actively planning. Nadal Hassan wasn't actively planning with Anwar al-Awlaki to engage in the terrorism. The Orlando shooter wasn't actively engaged with ISIS to plan out. He only pledged allegiance after the fact. So I'll let you decide on how much association is needed to create kind of that terrorist relationship. Mental illness. This has come up repeatedly. The argument is if you're mentally ill, you can't be a terrorist. That you can't engage in a political narrative because you're just not in control of your mind. I'll let you decide. Certainly, well, maybe not. Mental illness is a mitigating factor. That terrorism is a planned, coordinated issue, and if you're mentally ill, even though you're inspired by terrorists, you can't engage with it. Again, I'll let you decide. And then tool of the oppressed. I think we talked about levels of oppression. So that is kind of all the criteria. Don't just list out all these criteria. Choose a couple and then go in depth. And again, your paper, as I talked about, this is the format I'm looking for. And if there's policy recommendations, please include them. So again, illustrative example. The Irgun, highly oppressed, focused on the apparatus. Their target was the apparatus of oppression within the locus of conflict. You can build this argument to say the Irgun is not terrorist because, again, the backdrop of the Holocaust, they targeted the British apparatus of oppression primarily, and they conducted their attacks within the Israeli space, physical space. The FLN, highly oppressed, arguably, focused on civilians, so they didn't just kill military, but they killed lots of civilians as well and killed them in horrible ways. But they were within the locus of conflict. So you can make the argument the FLN is not a terrorist group, even though they focused on civilians because they were so oppressed. I'll let you make that argument if you so desire. And then Al-Qaeda. Again, this is prior to 9/11. Lightly oppressed. Osama bin Laden's organizing principle was the American occupation of Saudi Arabia, I should say. They focused on civilians primarily, and they conducted their attacks, particularly the 9/11 attacks, outside the locus of conflict. You can make the argument that Al-Qaeda would not be terrorists if they targeted military only the military assets in Saudi Arabia. But since they went beyond and attacked civilians in New York and Washington, that makes them a terrorist organization. So I've given you lots of room here, lots to work with. I think you have the basis of a paper here. And if there's questions or issues, I'm standing by for emails all week. So week 3 preview, again, because it's a short class, there's no time to give you a week to do your paper. We have to just keep going. So Terrorism History Part 3, The Road to 9/11. The Zakaria article, and when you're thinking about the Zakaria article and watching the documentary, The Road to 9/11, think about the social, political, demographic, historical, and cultural factors that led to 9/11, that also led to the rise of ISIS. And the documentary was written or done before the rise of ISIS, but some of those factors, social, political, were relevant in that case. So if there's any questions or issues, let me know, and I look forward to your to the briefing on Thursday and the discussion this week.